Logline people remember the Panzerfaust because it killed tanks. But what's more memorable is this. It tells the story of a nation retreating step by step, street by street. It was born to give German infantry a fighting chance against T-34s and Shermans, a cheap solution to an impossibly big problem. Then when everything collapsed, it was handed to children, to old men, to anyone still able to stand. When a weapon designed to save soldiers turns into a mass-produced illusion for civilians, where exactly is the line between war and crime? To understand how a cheap steel tube became one of the terrors of urban warfare, we have to go back to the moment the Germans realized they no longer controlled the game. In 1941-1942, Germany surged into the Soviet Union, believing that tanks plus doctrine would crush everything under their tracks. Then the T-34 and KV-1 appeared, like a slap-in-the-face sloped armor that was hard to penetrate powerful guns' rugged survivability that made many German units feel like they were shooting at rock. That wasn't just a technical shock, it was a psychological one. The dream of a perfect blitzkrieg suddenly slipped out of reach, and every kilometer of advance started to carry a price measured in blood. And what about the infantry? Early light anti-tank guns were beginning to fall behind. Anti-tank rifles became useless as armor thickened. Mines and satchel charges used up close were almost a one-way ticket. If the guns couldn't get there in time, if the tanks were already at the far end of the street, what did the infantrymen have left other than running? Once you've watched T-34s and KV-1s roll through everything a 37mm gun can do, the question is no longer, how do we shoot better? But what will keep the infantry alive when the tanks are already at the mouth of the alley? Out of that panic, the Germans turned to a problem framed in cold steel terms: cheap, compact, simple, mass-producible. Not a weapon for elite units, but something any frontline soldier could use. It had to be light enough for one man to carry, compact enough to handle in alleys, forest trenches, simple enough to teach in a few minutes, and cheap enough that factories could churn out not thousands, but millions in a short time. The key was the shaped charge warhead. Instead of needing a big gun, they used a clever principle to punch through armor with a focused jet. From there, the Germans accepted absolute minimalism, a disposable launch tube, one chance, one trigger pull. And it was that ruthless simplicity that changed urban warfare. At its core, the Panzerfaust was a simple launcher firing a shaped charge warhead, small, crude, but with frightening armor penetration for its cost. It gave the infantrymen a deeply human feeling: I can stop a tank too. But its short, effective range turned that belief into a gamble. To have a decent chance of a hit, the gunner had to close in step into the killing zone of machine guns and the tank's own escorting infantry. In cities, short range became an asset: windows, corners, stairwell, cellars. Every spot could be an ambush nest, but every shot also stripped away the shooter's cover. The response came within seconds: machine gun fire, high explosive shells, other tanks raking the area clean. That's why so many never came back. The Panzerfaust didn't turn German soldiers into heroes. It turned urban warfare into a lethal lottery. A weapon only becomes truly terrifying when it meets reality, when a soldier takes it out of the depot steps into mud and snow and dares to raise that tube at a block of steel charging toward him. In the autumn of 1943 on the Eastern Front, the Panzerfaust didn't arrive as some heroic legend. It arrived as a survival instinct. Soviet armored assaults forced German infantry into a simple choice: either find a way to fight back on the spot or be crushed. That's where the tank hunter teams came from: small groups of men, few in number, picking concealed positions and holding their breath as a tank swung its hull, exposing flank or rear, its most vulnerable moment. One shot, one explosion. And then they had to disappear instantly, because the second after that flash came hell itself, escorting infantry, charging machine guns, sweeping supporting guns, pounding the exact spot where the Panzerfaust had just fired. This was a dirty war in the purest sense. No time to check the kill, no time to celebrate. A cheap launcher might knock out an expensive machine, but the price was very often a human life. On the Eastern Front in 1943, the Panzerfaust was the infantry's ambush punch: cheap compact fire once and vanish. But in 1944-1945, when the fighting flooded into towns and cities, it truly came into its own. In the streets, short range is normal. Tanks had their view blocked by buildings, smoke, and blind corners. To maneuver, they had to expose their sides, get stuck on rubble, burned out vehicles, and anti-tank ditches. Every window was a firing point, every staircase an ambush nest, every attic a makeshift pillbox. The Allies had to adapt bolted-on armor plates, wire mesh, sandbags, skirts against hollow charges, anything that could push the blast farther away from the hull. And the hardest lesson was hammered into doctrine: tanks must not push deep into cities without infantry clearing house by house. In Normandy, amid the thick bocage like a maze of hedgerows, the rhythm of ambush was almost always the same silence: muzzle, flash, panic, and then dead quiet. As the war poured into the streets where every corner was a trap, the Germans knew that if they didn't extend the weapon's reach, they'd pay for it in blood inside enemy machine gun range. So the Panzerfaust went into an upgrade montage: 30, 60, 100, 150, and even the planned 250. Each number was a promise: further, surer, stronger, so the soldier could fire before he heard the engine roaring right in front of him. But one thing never changed, no matter how new the model, the Panzerfaust was still a close-range weapon. Fire and you're exposed. Miss and you're done. And one heartbeat of hesitation could cost your life. That's what made it both terrifying and tragic, a weapon constantly improved, while the man using it still had to step into the kill zone of the battle. At that point, you realized Germany's problem wasn't just technical. The problem was that they were racing against time and losing. Germany didn't only have the Panzerfaust. They built an entire anti-tank ecosystem to keep infantry upright in front of the armored tide. Panzerschreck is the clearest example. Reusable good range, impressive power. But the trade-off was weight bulk and the need for a well-drilled team to operate it. On one side, you had the Panzerfaust light single-use handed out everywhere like handing out hope. On the other hand, the Panzerschreck, stronger but expensive in effort, requiring coordination, discipline, and training time, all things Germany had less and less of as the war dragged on. The bitter truth is this: when industry can no longer cover the losses, the battlefield pays with people. Every anti-tank solution pulled the soldier closer to the target and closer to dying. 8. Why did Germany stand out? Because it had no other choice. Once you look at this German anti-tank ecosystem, you can glance across the lines and see a sharp contrast. The Americans had the bazooka, reusable, longer range, but early versions weren't always reliable. More importantly, it was never handed out on the same universal scale as the Panzerfaust. Not every squad had multiple men sitting with launchers at every corner. The British had the Piat, no backblast, so it could be fired from rooms and dugouts. That was a real advantage. But in return, it was heavy, violent in recoil, awkward to handle, and demanded well-trained crews. The Soviets leaned heavily on anti-tank guns, Molotov cocktails, and demolition charges, and whenever they captured Panzerfausts, they used them immediately. They had large numbers of tanks, so the burden of stopping tanks didn't rest as heavily on each individual infantryman as it did on the Germans. If you look only at technology, it's easy to praise German ingenuity. But in truth, they stood out for a much simpler reason: they had no other choice. The Allies had industry and tanks to plug the gaps. Germany tried to fill those same gaps with weapons based on one man, one shot, one slim hope. The Panzerfaust did give them a chance. But no country can win a war on desperate chances alone. In the third act of the war, the Panzerfaust stopped being just a piece of military hardware. It turned into a mirror reflecting total collapse. When the Volkssturm was raised and the Hitler Youth were dragged into the streets, that cheap launcher was shoved into the hands of people who should have been at home: old men, teenagers, even children. Training often amounted to a few rushed instructions, 1 or 2 practice shots, and then they were told, "When the tanks come, you fire." It sounds simple, but psychologically it's a steel trap. If you don't shoot, your home may be crushed. If you do, you might die before you can run. Sometimes the Panzerfaust really did burn, a Sherman really did jam a crossroads. But it could not save a regime that was out of manpower, out of fuel, out of time. And that's what makes this story chilling. The price of a final line of defense was a generation being dragged out as offerings in the name of fight to the last. The Panzerfaust began as a technical fix. It ended as a ritual sacrifice of human beings. Out of the ashes of 1945, the Panzerfaust left behind a legacy bigger than itself. The idea that a lone infantryman with a shoulder-fired weapon could threaten a tank. After the war, that lesson spread. Armies everywhere realized they could not always roll anti-tank guns into the right place at the right time. They began handing veto power over tanks to each small unit. Designs in the RPG family appeared more compact, longer-ranged, reloadable, durable in use, but still rooted in the same spirit. One hit from an infantryman can flip the outcome of a clash with armor. In later urban wars, the same motif repeats. Tanks don't fear their own thick armor. They fear the corners that hide people and the intentions no radar can see. In that, the shadow of the Panzerfaust remains long after the name itself has changed. On film, the Panzerfaust is usually portrayed as a single dramatic moment. The tank jolts to a halt, smoke billows up, and the camera stamps victory on the scene before cutting away. But real history isn't that loud. It's cold heavy, and it echoes for a long time. Picture the final shot, a rusting launcher lying in the rubble, silent like a full stop at the end of an entire age. The Panzerfaust is not a story about power. It's a story about desperation, about a society pushed so far it hands weapons to children and the elderly to cling to each remaining intersection, staircase, and room. When options run out, people themselves become the currency. And that's the warning history leaves us. Once war pushes into civilian homes, everything instantly turns into frontline windows, corridors, the dark corner behind a wall. If you were the crew of a tank ordered into a city full of ambush points, what would you truly fear more? The 88mm guns out in the open, or a cheap launcher waiting behind a second-floor window? The real lesson isn't in the technical specs of the weapon, but in what it says about a nation when they have to lean on simple fixes to patch over a system that's breaking, war stops, being a matter for the front lines, and becomes a tragedy for the entire society.